Hi, everyone. Welcome to Large Scale Agrivoltaics webinar. This is a really exciting topic for me and everyone on our panel tonight. We're going to be talking about beekeeping and pollinators on utility scale solar facilities in Western New York. As you know, this agrivoltaics and beekeeping is an exciting new movement in the beekeeping world, and we're excited to share the information that we've collected over the last several years that we've been doing this and some new projects that are coming up. My name is Dustin Vanas. I'm the CEO of Bear Honey. We are a solar-based beekeeping company in Minnesota. We also operate on solar facilities in Iowa and Florida, and this coming year in Texas as well. We work with large companies like Enel Green Power to small regional companies like US Solar in the Midwest here. We started doing this as an environmental mission of our company. As we built our business, we wanted to figure out ways that we can, save the pollinators and preserve beekeeping as we know it. And then working with the Center for Pollinators and Energy, we started to come up with ideas of how to plant pollinator-friendly habitat underneath the solar arrays and create an idea of what's called agrivoltaics, which is the combining of agriculture and voltaics, which is the production of energy. This last year, we produced about 25 tons of solar-grown honey on 26 different projects in 4 states, and we're in about 100 stores with our solar-grown honey at this point. Tonight, there's a really interesting idea that we're going to be talking about and the project that we're going to be talking about, and that's the Morris Ridge Solar Energy Center project. It's engineered to generate about 177 megawatts of solar electricity. The Morris Ridge project consists of ground-mounted solar arrays, approximately 1,000 acres of leased private land from the town of Mount Morris in Livingston County, New York. EDF Renewables is operating the solar array there, and they're planning to incorporate co-location of agriculture activities within the Morris Ridge solar energy sites. This includes managed sheep for grazing and vegetation control. So if you think of this as in like how the prairies used to be managed, well, they used to be managed by bison, right? And so native plants need to be managed also. And the sheep can manage this for us. And then also the introduction of beekeeping to pollinate those plants. Tonight, you'll be hearing from some of the key innovators on this agrivoltaic adventure. First, I'd like to introduce you to Eva Hoskin. Eva is the executive director of United Solar Energy Supporters. They're a 501(c) nonprofit organization based in New York State who has a goal of be a resource for anyone who wants to learn about solar projects, whether that be from municipalities to the general public, neighbors, landowners, beekeepers, and everyone in between. So Eva, if you'd like to say a few words and introduce yourself to everyone.
Thank you, Dustin. You took a lot of the words right out of my mouth. So yes, I am Eva Hoskin, Executive Director of USES. As he mentioned, we're a grassroots network of solar energy supporters. We support solar through doing, many educational outreach efforts, such as hosting a webinar just like this one. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I really quickly want to just go over a couple of housekeeping items. So first of all, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our website and YouTube channel by tomorrow. These slides will also be available for you to review at a later time. For questions, please post them in the Q&A function of the chat, of the Zoom, and we'll get to those towards the end of the session. If you would like a training certificate for completing this session, please email usesny@gmail.com. I will put that email in the chat. But yeah, usesny@gmail.com. Please do so after the webinar, and we will get to those over the next couple of days. And then lastly, if you'd like to support USES so that we can continue to do these educational efforts, please visit usesusa.org/donate. If you're interested in becoming a member, go to usesusa.org/membership. And then really quickly, I do want to let you know that USES has been working on a solar film series for quite some time now. And those 3 short films will be released towards the end of this month, mid to end of this month. So please keep an eye out for that. And we will definitely let you know when those are available. And with that, I pass it back to Dustin. And thanks once again for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Eva, and thanks for hosting this series of webinars. This is really important work that you guys are doing. So thank you very, 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 very much from the bottom of my heart, for sure. Next, I'd like to introduce you to David DeSalvo. David is the town supervisor of Mount Morris, and having served on the town board for over 20 years, David and his colleagues were brainstorming and trying to figure out what else to do with the solar projects in their community. And that was the birth of the Mount Morris Agrivoltaics study. This report will be made available to everyone on this webinar. I had a chance to review it today, and it holds some great information. I encourage everyone to download a copy of it and read it for themselves. And in fact, this report was actually selected for the Agrivoltaics 2022 conference in Italy this summer to be a virtual poster presentation. So David, if you'd like to talk a little bit about how Mount Morris and your work has engendered this project.
Oh, thanks. I'm having technical difficulties with the camera, so I apologize. But when we were approached with the solar, I just started doing some background work, out of the projects and everything. And I just noticed that a lot of sheep was involved, or bees. So then as the project started to be developing, me and a couple other board members met with Kevin, and I said, are we going to be able to do this? And he goes, yeah, I'm pretty certain that things are starting to develop with sheep, herding and bees. So that's where the study took us to here. And now look at it, we won a presentation. So it feels pretty nice that we were at, first time on the drawing board to being a poster child, I guess you could say, for, sheep and bees. So I'm hoping it works with this project, that we have a couple herds and a lot of beehives, and be one of the leading producers of honey in New York. So thanks.
Those are all great things. And thank you, David. Next, in getting to the meat and potatoes, as it were, of our discussion tonight, I'd like to introduce you to Mary Kate McKenzie. Mary Kate is an agricultural economist, educator, and beekeeper. In 2017 and 18, she worked for the Dice Lab for honeybee studies at Cornell University, where she supported the New York State Beekeepers Tech Team and developed a financial benchmarking program for beekeepers. Mary Kate and her husband operate Sweetgrass Meats, a grazing farm and retail meats business in Naples, New York. They had firsthand experience with agrivoltaics, and as they graze sheep on the community solar farm in the last season, tonight, Mary Kate will share with you her expertise and experience in the business of solar beekeeping. Mary Kate?
Thanks, Dustin. I'll go ahead and get started sharing my screen. I really appreciate that introduction, and it turns out we're right in the middle of lambing season now, so you might hear some little lamb sounds coming in the background. So, and I noticed that some of my, some folks from Cornell, colleagues of mine from Cornell, are attending tonight, and I want to welcome you all and say thank you for being here. I work with Cornell Cooperative Extension, but this particular project is a project I got recruited to work on in my, given my background in beekeeping. So this was a private consulting project that I was happy to be part of the team working on the Morris Ridge Agrivoltaics study. So the portion of the study focused on grazing sheep was presented already by my colleague, and tonight we'll be focusing on the beekeeping side of things. As Dustin said, I bring a background not just in agricultural economics, but also as a beekeeper. And my husband and I have experience with agrivoltaics directly through grazing sheep on a solar site in Geneva. Our farm is based outside of Naples, New York, in Yates County, but we're not too far away from Livingston County and Mount Morris, which is the site of the proposed Morris Ridge solar development. So tonight, I'm going to focus on, really my goal is to help all of you in the audience understand a little bit more about beekeeping and the perspective of beekeepers coming to the table to explore this kind of arrangement, this agrivoltaic arrangement. So as we know, these sorts of arrangements need to be a win-win, both for the farmer and for the developer, and ideally also for the town, the municipality, and the community. And so we're going to explore kind of what some of the needs are for beekeepers to make this a success. To start, I'm just going to review a little bit about what solar beekeeping is, and then we're going to talk about what drives economic success for beekeepers, what drives honey yields in New York State, and how beekeepers perceive agrivoltaics, or the solar beekeeping arrangement. And then I'm going to wrap up with some recommendations for developers, one of which is going to be to read our study. So I'm going to try to keep it succinct and really highlight the key points. But if any of you are want to nerd out on the nitty-gritty details, I would really encourage you to check out the report, and I'll tell you how you can find that as well. So to get started, just as Dustin already said, solar beekeeping is sort of an emerging agrivoltaic practice that combines solar production, solar energy production, and agriculture in the form of beekeeping. So in a solar beekeeping arrangement, a beekeeper would set up an apiary, which is a collection of honeybee colonies, either within or alongside a solar PV system. And the motivation here, again, is to try to find synergies in land use in our rural agricultural areas. And this is a really big deal in New York State because we're going to be seeing a lot of change in some of our agricultural landscapes as solar expands in the coming years. So solar beekeeping is this opportunity for the same piece of land to support solar energy production as well as agricultural enterprise. And in addition, just, you know, I'm going to be talking about the business of solar beekeeping tonight, but we can also acknowledge that that land use patterns that are good for honeybees are often also very, very good for our wild and native pollinators that play a key role in providing pollination services, both to natural landscapes and habitats, as well as agricultural landscapes. So we don't want to forget about our native pollinators, although I'm going to be focusing on honeybees here tonight. So why do we focus so much about honeybees? Well, they're very valuable to agriculture in New York State. So on its own, honey production in New York State is estimated at around $11 million. So that is impressive, but that is a small fraction of the value of the actual pollination services that honeybees provide. Typically, there's both a commercial pollination, which refers to beekeepers being paid to locate their colonies in agricultural areas with insect pollination dependent crops. So think about apples. That's one of our #1 specialty crops in New York State. And having honeybees located in apple orchards at the time of bloom has a really big impact on the size, value, abundance of that crop. So there's an estimated value of commercial pollination somewhere between $300 and over $400 million a year. And then the total value of crops in New York State that are reliant on insects for pollination is upwards of $600 million. So New York State is home to more than 400 bee species, but the honeybee is the most economically important to our farmers. So how we came to this study, this series of questions, is that we, the folks that were involved in this Mount Morris solar project wanted to really understand how to attract and retain a beekeeper, a beekeeping enterprise within their development. So in order to enhance our understanding of how to do that well, we have a series of questions that form the motivation for this study. So first, we wanted to understand better what beekeepers need from solar sites in order to be successful. And so that both is kind of a question about logistics, as well as a question about economics. How can we ensure that this site is going to be logistically viable and economically valuable to the beekeeper? We also wanted to ask broadly how to identify good apiary locations, both within the Mount Morris site, but also thinking about a methodology for identifying good apiary locations in other areas potentially. And then finally, just this broader question of how can a solar development attract and retain beekeepers. And so we wanted to come up with a set of best practices, both through direct engagement with beekeepers, as well as a review of some relevant literature. So the methods that went into this portion, the beekeeping portion of the study, involved a beekeeper survey with a fairly small number of beekeepers, but this was a very in-depth survey covering all aspects of their operation, from honey yields, revenues, operating expenses, to their perceptions of solar beekeeping and the logistics involved in setting up a successful solar apiary. We were very fortunate that we had 4 large commercial beekeeping operations participate in the survey, and all of them were located in the central Western New York region, so they were somewhat familiar with Mount Morris and the project area. We also included 1 smaller beekeeping operation in the study to ensure that we had that perspective represented as well. From the survey information, I developed an economic model representing, I call it an apiary budget. So the apiary, again, is that collection of honeybee colonies that's managed as an economic unit by a beekeeper. They're clustered together in one location. And so when we think about setting up a beekeeping enterprise on a solar site, we would think about 1 or more apiaries. So what are the costs to operate that apiary, and what would that bring in terms of revenue to support the business? And then the third step in the study was to do some landscape analysis using GIS to actually do some mapping of different landscape types around the project area to see if we could glean something about the characteristics of the landscape and whether or not that would support the production, enough honey production to have a successful beekeeping enterprise. Okay, so I'm gonna dive into the results, and as I mentioned, our report is very nuanced and detailed, but I want to try and distill it down into 3 key take-home messages that you can leave tonight and remember these 3 key points from the presentation, what we learned. So, and I'm going to go into more detail on each of these points and provide evidence from our research to support them. But the key points are, number 1, honey yields drive economic success. And honey yields, that just means the amount of honey that a colony will produce in a year, in a production season. So the more honey that our colonies produce, the more economic return will generate in our apiary. Number 2, landscape composition drives honey yields. And I'm going to talk about exactly what that means in terms of the area that the honeybees rely upon for their forage, and what needs to be present in that area to support an economically viable yield. And then number 3, I want to communicate this idea that solar apiaries are just apiaries to a beekeeper, right? So beekeepers are going to be using a similar set of characteristics and criteria to identify good apiary location, whether or not there's solar panels in the neighborhood. So diving in a little bit deeper to the first point here. Honey yield drives economic success. So for beekeeping businesses in New York State, they may generate income from commercial pollination or producing other honeybee colonies for sale. But the number 1 source of income by far is the production and sale of honey. And honey yields are highly variable across space and time. So the figure that is showing up here is the average honey yield in terms of the number of pounds per honeybee colony from 1990 until today, or 2020. So over the last 20 years, you can see incredible variation, annual variation in honey yields. And these are just averages, right? So you can think that individual beekeepers might have yields that are much higher or much lower than the averages that are presented here. So we see variability not just across time, but also across space. you might have apiaries that are several miles apart, but because of different conditions in the landscape, have vastly different honey yields. So for what does this mean for our study? Well, for the economic model, we had to choose a honey yield, make an assumption about the honey yield on this particular site in Mount Morris in order to evaluate revenues and expenses for the beekeeper. So we used a yield of 60 pounds per colony for a medium and large apiary. And then we also modeled a smaller apiary with a higher honey yield. And these yields came from survey data. So these are what the beekeepers reported as typical or average honey yields across their operations. And we assumed a higher yield for the smaller apiary due to a higher intensity of management and a lower stocking rate. So fewer colonies per apiary means access to more forage per colony. And as a result, our small apiary had, because of this higher yield assumption, we saw the small apiary had higher revenues per colony because they had more honey per colony to sell, but also had a higher expenses on a per colony basis. So one of the metrics that we can use to evaluate profitability or performance, financial performance for apiary is the operating profit margin. So this is a ratio that gets at how many dollars of profit do we generate for every dollar of sales. And you can see some general benchmarks for agricultural businesses where an operating profit margin over 25% is considered strong, over 10% would be stable, and above 0 indicates a positive return. And so this is a metric we calculated for the apiaries that we modeled in the study. And we found that the large apiary had the highest operating profit margin. So 14% profit margin means that for every dollar of sales, we generated 14 cents in profits. And that accounts for the value of operator labor and management, as well as all of the operating expenses. So our largest apiary had our highest profit margin, and the small apiary actually had a negative profit margin. And that reflected some assumptions we made about labor. So our small apiary, which was a 10 colony apiary, relied on a lot of labor from the beekeeper. And that represents a beekeeping business that is at a scale at which it is truly a business. The beekeeper would be selling honey, right? Generating revenues, but would be sort of, I would say, not reliant on that business for their income, right? So the small beekeeper that we interviewed for this study fit into that category with around 50 colonies. They're operating a substantial business, but not generating their income from that activity. So whereas the medium apiary of 30 colonies and a large apiary of 60 colonies reflect more of a commercial scale operation where the beekeeper is actually generating their livelihood from this activity. So the take-home message here is that if we look at our honey yields and compare them with our profit margin, we can see the sort of break-even yield that's required depending on the apiary size, given all the assumptions that we made about the cost of production, the cost structure for these different size apiaries. And so you can see that the large apiary at 51 pounds of honey per colony would break even, whereas the medium apiary would have to have 58 pounds of honey per colony to achieve that break-even margin. Why is this important? Because beekeepers really need a honey yield, a minimum honey yield for an apiary to be economically viable. So if you as a developer want to recruit a beekeeper to your site, you need to convince them that the honey yield will be there. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how we can predict what kinds of yields the beekeepers will achieve. So that brings me to the second key message from the study, which is that landscape composition drives honey yield. So what does this mean? Well, the composition of vegetation in the landscape has a really big impact on the productivity of honeybees. So how much honey they're generating, or how much pollen and nectar they're collecting and storing. And it also influences their health. So while we have many flowering plants in our landscape, there's really a pretty small number that produce enough nectar for honeybees to collect and store and generate surplus honey. And you can see the table here listing some of the most important honey plants and habitat types in New York State, which varies by season, right? So we have different things that are blooming in spring, summer, and fall. That means that if your apiary doesn't move, if you have bees that are on the same site for the entire season, you need to ensure that they have access to adequate nectar supply from these different plants and habitat types at different times throughout the season. We also know that certain landscape covers have negative impacts on bees. So in particular, certain types of cropping systems that are managed using conventional insecticides, fungicides, herbicides can pose really serious health risks to bees. And so beekeepers look to minimize their exposure to all different kinds of pesticides by avoiding certain conventional cropping systems. In particular, in this part of New York State, corn and soy are of high convenience, commonly in the form of treated seeds. And neonicotinoids are highly toxic to bees, and they can persist in the environment. So it's important for folks to understand, I think this is one of the hardest things to understand about beekeeping as a agricultural activity. And that is, like, honeybees are truly free range, right? You cannot tell a honeybee where to go. You can control where it goes solely by placing its colony, locating its apiary in a certain spot. So you have control over where the apiary goes, but beyond that, honeybees are going to forage around their home base, and the typical foraging distance is about a mile. It is about 1.5 kilometers, and in our study, we rounded up and used 1,600 meters as a radius for mapping and analysis purposes. So this map actually shows the 3 sites that we analyzed at the Morris Ridge development, so right south of the town of Mount Morris. And the green circle represents the 1,600 meter radius foraging area around each of those sites. And then the lighter green circle represents an extended foraging radius of about 2 miles around each site. So you can see that the larger foraging radiuses actually overlap, even though the sites are situated several miles apart. So the question then becomes, do we have good and bad landscape types in our foraging radius? Do we have high value habitats and honey plants that are going to provide the nutrition that our bees need and the volume of nectar, of honey, nectar flows to support that surplus honey production? So these are the positive things that beekeepers are looking for within that foraging radius. And then we're also going to ask whether there are high risk land uses or crop types present in the same area. And in this case, in particular, we see a lot of cropping right kind of in the middle. So if almost like inside that triangle between those 3 sites, we can see corn in yellow and soybeans in purple. And those are 2 land uses of concern to beekeepers, right? And then alfalfa is not as concerning, but it oftentimes there's chemicals used in that, glyphosate used in that production that some beekeepers are concerned about. So in this particular area, we see more appealing habitats kind of towards the fringe or the outside of that land use. We see some forested areas, And then we have a smaller amount of grasslands and some grass hay in our overall area. So what can we glean from this? Well, we use some criteria developed from the literature to try and compare what we had on this site to existing criteria to get a sense of whether or not this would provide all the needs of a commercial apiary. And using that criteria, we found that these sites met some but not all of the criteria to support a large apiary. We also when we talked with beekeepers about this location, some of them had concerns, particularly around the extent of cropping in the area. And we also were not able to find anyone actively keeping bees in this region, which is another point of concern, right? If we don't have any established beekeepers here, we don't really know what the production potential is. And so there's more risk for beekeepers thinking about setting up a new site in this area. For folks that are not able to do this level of comprehensive geospatial analysis for your project, there is a tool that you can access, this Beescape tool, which allows you to set a site and get a sort of a rough assessment of some of the positive and negative aspects of that site. The caveat, or maybe the key point for this particular project, the Morris Ridge project, is, as Dustin mentioned, the intent of the developer is to establish permanent pasture on the site under and around the solar panels, as well as some pollinator-friendly plantings in the buffer zones across the site. And so if we consider that change in land use from some of the corn, soy, hay, other land use to a kind of a grassland supporting some flowering plants, we actually see that that site suddenly looks a lot better compared to these criteria that we're using. So
Hey, Mary Kate, you froze for me. I'm not sure if that happened for the other panelists as well.
Yes, she froze for me also.
Okay, Mary Kate, maybe you can try turning your camera off, and that might save a little bit of, you know, internet, however it works.
Yeah, in the meantime, while we're waiting for Mary Kate, I can add into some of the things that I've learned also on solar, is that when we're picking out sites for solar placement, a lot of things we look at is that these are apiary sites. They're not just solar sites, as she was saying. In that regard, what we're looking for is how many hives we can have per acre on the solar site. But it's not just what is planted on the site, it's also what's around the site. So in our area, there's copious amount of sites that are located in forested areas. The site itself has a cyclically blooming cycle of pollinator habitat. However, we're also looking for honey crops like the linden tree or basswood trees that are in the area that are going to produce a honey crop as well. And what we found is that our bees are much healthier on the solar sites because they have that cyclically blooming wildflower abundance that's available. And when that comes to then being able to harvest the honey crop, there's a much larger population of healthy bees that are in the hives, and so we are able to harvest larger yields from our hives because there's larger healthy populations of bees because of the abundance of pollen that's available on the solar sites.
Hi, Dustin. I'm so sorry.
All right. Sorry,
Yeah,
I was just filling in for you while you were getting back there.
The beauties of living in the rural community is we don't always have great internet.
Understood. Take it back over.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just gonna transition to my next main take-home point. Get it going again. Whoops, let me start from the right slide. So the final key result that I wanted to share with you all is this idea that solar apiaries are just apiaries to a beekeeper. And now this may be a little bit of an oversimplification, but the point here is that beekeepers are very used to working with private landowners to set up apiaries on sites really all over the country. Many of our beekeepers in New York travel out of state in the wintertime. And then others, there are also commercial beekeepers that stay in New York year round and overwinter bees here. But the vast majority of apiaries are situated on private land that beekeepers do not control. So they are very experienced at working with private landowners to come to these mutual agreements. What beekeepers are not generally experienced at is having written leases. And so that's really the big new piece that we recommend introducing. So most beekeepers are rural folks who take great pride in having these long-standing relationships with landowners, but they're often just handshake agreements. And some beekeepers even have apiaries that have been on site for multiple generations with no written agreement. So there's a lot of pride and trust that goes into those relationships. But the beekeepers that we interviewed said that they would be willing to work out written agreements with solar developers. And that's what we recommend, just to deal with work out all of the arrangements and avoid potential surprises for both parties. But in general, the beekeepers that we surveyed were willing to drive between 25 and 50 miles to establish a new apiary. So if you're looking to recruit a beekeeper, you're likely to be limited to some degree to folks that are already operating in your area. And many of them expressed a preference, if they were going to travel farther, they would want to set up more than one apiary. So they could have 2 or possibly 3 apiaries in a general region to make that travel time worthwhile, although they would need at least 1 to 4 miles between those sites. And then in the table here are listed the top criteria that beekeepers mentioned when selecting a site within that driving distance. And you can read a lot more in detail about each of these criteria if you'd like to dive into that in our report. I also want to mention that of the 5 beekeepers we surveyed, 4 of them expressed really positive attitudes towards solar beekeeping. And the beekeeper that did not have a really positive attitude about it, it was mainly because his perception was that a solar landscape would not provide the criteria that he looks for in a site. So I think that the key here is understanding what beekeepers look for and ensuring that you can provide that and communicate that as you're trying to recruit someone to work with you. We also wanted to know whether beekeepers would see value in having their apiaries on solar sites for marketing, right? Could beekeepers charge a premium price to market solar honey? And would that be a perceived benefit for them? And based on the survey data, the beekeepers, most of the commercial beekeepers had very little direct retail sales. So most of them were selling barrels of honey as a wholesale product, and they didn't see a lot of value in that solar honey marketing because they weren't doing direct marketing. So I think that's something to keep in mind if you're thinking about what type of beekeeping business you might want to recruit or work with. You'd want to know if they do direct retail sales, and in that case, there might be added benefit for them. And Nicole's going to talk a little bit more about that shortly. So I think I'm getting close to my time, and I have detail about all these recommendations in my presentation, but I'm not going to have time to talk through everything at this point. So we're going to be sharing slides. And again, all this is in our written report, so I invite you to look it up. But in general, things to think about, considerations as a developer looking to work with a beekeeper. You really want to find somebody that is good, a good manager and is good to work with. And you should take time to find a beekeeper who's really a good fit for the goals and characteristics of your project. It's important to provide enough space for beekeepers, so you might not realize how much space they need, with the ability to move equipment around and work. Not just the bees take up space, but when the beekeepers are there, they need to have sufficient space to work around the bees. There's a bunch of recommendations for prioritizing safety and security for bees as well as for people. This is going to be really important because if you put the bees in the wrong spot, there is potential for them to be a nuisance. And so you want to think about that going into it. Thinking about vegetation management, there's a lot of great information about pollinator plantings out there, how to manage vegetation to benefit pollinators, pollinator conservation. But if you are trying to recruit a beekeeper, you really need to also think about honey production. So not only general pollinator goals, but specifically what are the kinds of plants that beekeepers in your area rely on to generate honey. And then the point about seeking input from outside experts. So I'm an economist, I'm not a biologist, and the decision-making and planning that goes into establishing pollinator plantings and maintaining them over time is something that is going to be new to folks, many folks that are experienced in solar development. So it's recommended to seek out a biologist or ecologist with local knowledge of plantings and pollinators, and then potentially to use third-party providers to both perform maintenance as well as inspect and ensure that the plantings, if you're investing in these pollinator plantings, that they really persist over time. You have to protect that investment for the facility and for the beekeepers to have that pollinator benefit. And then finally, I'm going to skip ahead and just highlight this, that we have the Mount Morris Agrivoltaics study. So this again will give you a lot more detail on the themes that we've talked about tonight. And I'm hoping that somebody can put the link in the chat, or I can do it later myself, but you can also find it on the Morris Ridge Solar Project website, and I think also on the USIS website. So I invite you to check that out if you'd like to know more, and feel free to throw questions at us tonight. And then you can see my contact information here if you would like to get in touch.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mary Kate. All your information has been great, and the report that's coming out is equally valuable, if not more, with a much more detail. And I am an econ nerd, so I really enjoyed reading over it this afternoon. So thank you. To be quick, I know Nicole Manipul has a hard out at 7 o'clock, so I'll introduce you very quickly, Nicole. Next up is Nicole Manipul, and she's the Community and Economic Development Specialist for the Rural Community Association Partnership. She also serves as Director and Lead Strategist for Letchworth Gateway Villages, a municipal alliance committed to advocating for rural innovation. Prior to returning to home in Western New York in 2017, Nicole spent the previous 15 years in international development, working across the world on behalf of USAID. Something that's close to my heart also. I do that often. What she loves most about her line of work is that creating opportunities for people, organizations, and communities to realize their potential, education, and consumer demand of solar-grown honeys, which we'll be talking about tonight. Nicole, are you there?
Yes, I am, Dustin. Thank you. And can you see my my slides?
We can, yep.
Okay. And so when and I know that you're probably not seeing them in presenter mode.
Correct.
Okay. My issue is when I do that, I can't see the rest of my screen. So let's see. I don't know, Mary Kate, do you have any suggestions for that?
I don't. I think
there.
Yeah.
Is that good enough for folks? If I leave it at this size, is it large enough?
I think so. Otherwise, Eva may be able to go through the slides for you also.
Yeah, if that makes it easier for you, if I go through them, I totally can, whichever works for you.
Yeah, I just, having some notes up, it's hard to see both on my my screen.
Absolutely.
So do you need me to stop sharing or?
I can do that, just 1 second. Just have to pull it up.
It looks like everyone in the chat also says that they can see the presentation just fine on their screens. So we
Okay,
can probably
so
just continue because I know you have a hard out.
Yeah, no problem. Thank
Okay.
you. So thank you, everyone. It's great to be back. As for some of you who might have tuned into the other webinar we did last month on the lamb demand, you know that I did this portion along with my colleagues. And just by way of a little bit of background, Letchworth Gateway Villages is a municipal alliance that's committed to advancing rural development in the Genesee Valley. We do this through network building, technical assistance, and research to support, regional partnerships, collaboration needed to build a modern 21st century rural economy. And Mount Morris has been one of the founding partners of this. And so working as a consultant, this is really what I was doing in my previous role, serving as their part-time director. So the work that we did was mainly a complement to all of the research that Mary Kate did on, some of the business opportunities for apiarists and for developers considering, how to select different types of, bee enterprises for their projects. And so the work that we did really focused on trying to understand what the current market demand for solar raised honey was in the Genesee Finger Lakes region. So we conducted interviews with 15 local food manufacturers, craft beverage producers, and retailers. And our main goal with these interviews was to provide a snapshot of the current demand for honey in the region. So this wasn't an extensive market study, but it really looked at, kind of the key outlets where people would be buying honey, from a tourism and, kind of retail perspective. Again, our goal was to look at, and evaluate whether there was future market opportunities for local apiarists producing solar raised honey. And additionally, we wanted to understand, as Mary Kate kind of ended there, understand current perceptions of solar raised honey and whether honey marketed as solar raised mattered to consumers and businesses. And as you heard from Mary Kate, people were a little bit, apiarists at least, were a little bit skeptical. And this was similar with many of the businesses that we spoke to. Go to slide 2. So the businesses we interviewed were selected to provide really a representative sample of potential markets for future solar raised honey produced in the region. So we we reached out to 20 businesses and had 15 that responded. These included retailers located at major tourist attractions in the Genesee Valley, like Letchworth State Park, which attracts nearly 1 million visitors per year, and Taste New York market retail locations located at major throughway stops and visitor centers across New York State. We also interviewed major food manufacturers in Western New York and craft beverage producers and specialty food retailers in the area's largest Main Street districts, which include Geneseo in Livingston County and Perry in Wyoming County. And apart from the 6 Taste New York market retail locations, most businesses surveyed were in the Genesee Valley region of Western New York. And I have listed there some of the different businesses that we ended up surveying. Letchworth State Park, for example, had 7 concession locations in the park. The Taste New York visitor centers were 11 throughout the state. So through a combination of phone interviews, email correspondence, respondents were asked to provide information about their business. For example, the customer base, main products and geographic market reach, and their current demand for honey. So the cost of the honey they purchased and retail margin on the honey they sold. Additionally, businesses were asked whether, from a marketing standpoint, solar raised honey would be more attractive to their customer base. So, one thing to think about, and, it was interesting to hear Mary Kate's, research about, there weren't really, she had a hard time finding apiarists who were producing honey in the region. And what I learned from some of the local businesses that I spoke to, that because of COVID-19, many of, there was, significant disruptions in the supply chain of the honey that they were getting. And so a lot of the data that I have, comes from pre-2020, but also, it didn't provide the best snapshot of what kind of the demand was prior to the pandemic, just because so many people weren't producing honey. And in fact, one of the large food manufacturers that we had interviewed that had a whole line of products dedicated to honey, they had to completely cut off that part of their business during COVID, because they just couldn't source the honey that they had previously had. So, as you can see here, the demand is really different depending, by the business that, we surveyed. So for example, retailers, for the most part purchased honey by the case in 8 to 24 ounce retail bottles, with the average cost ranging anywhere from $3 to $15 a bottle, or $2 to $4 a pound for unbottled honey that was procured in a bucket. In high tourism areas, so a lot of the Taste New York market locations, like in the Hudson Valley, in the Catskills, down in Long Island, around New York City, they reported selling close to 200 bottles of honey per month. In more rural areas in the Genesee Valley, that's kind of the quantity that those retailers would go through in a year. So there's a kind of huge difference right now between, an opportunity, I would say, for retailers selling honey in high tourism areas versus places where, we do have strong tourism during certain times of the year, but it's not as robust as some of these other places. And again, this is during the pandemic. Retailers were most concerned about price, consistency, and where their honey was sourced. So local was really, really important. And in fact, talking to one of the Taste New York market retailers in Long Island, the woman indicated to me that, they used to sell honey produced in upstate New York and had to stop because customers were actually, they felt like that wasn't local enough, that the fact that it was produced in New York State, wasn't somehow as attractive as something that was produced nearby in Long Island. So that was something we heard across the board from retailers. Breweries, 2 out of the 3 breweries surveyed used honey on a consistent basis. The honey purchased for these businesses were purchased in 5-gallon buckets for $150 per bucket and sourced locally. Again, price, locally raised. And for them, the taste flavor profile was of most importance based on, obviously that they're creating a beverage or a food product. So that was one of their key considerations. For food manufacturers, 2 of the 3 food manufacturers used honey. And again, like I said, the one had to discontinue their line due to the pandemic. But the volume of honey ranged from 65-pound buckets procured 4 times per year at a rate of $150 a bucket to 650 pounds metal drums and 3,000-pound totes purchased monthly at a rate of $1.50 to $3.25 a pound. And the cost obviously was determined by the kind of honey, whether it was organic, free trade, etc. Trying to go, there we go. So perspectives on solar raised honey. The interview questions we asked, I've got them listed here on the side. And, we really just wanted to understand from a marketing standpoint, Honey marketed as solar raised, would it be more attractive to the customer base? Did retailers think that they would be able to, or businesses think they'd be able to charge more, a higher price for solar raised honey over other types of local honey? From a business perspective, would they be more inclined to buy solar raised honey over other types of local honey? Why or why not? And would they be interested in learning more about solar raised honey when it becomes available? And so, you know, again, like Mary Kate indicated, you know, people really didn't know anything about solar raised honey. What did it mean? You know, most people did not feel like it would be a differentiating factor for their customer base simply because their customers didn't know what that meant. A lot of the Taste New York market retail locations, many of which are run by Cornell Cooperatives. So the staff there are, you know, obviously highly educated about the different products that they're providing. They had questions about whether or not solar raised honey had any sort of different nutritional value than regular honey. So, you know, just the key takeaway here was just that there's really not enough yet known about this product for them to say whether or not it would influence a consumer's decision. I have some of the quotes here from the market retailer and also the local food manufacturer. Most people ended with that, yes, they would be intrigued by solar raised honey. Not quite sure if it would make me more inclined to buy it though. I would have to have more information on the details and the pros and cons in comparison to traditional methods. And for the local food manufacturer, they could see the benefit of, you know, having a honey that was sustainable, ethically raised. They could see that it could potentially be a good market differentiator like organic. And they would definitely be interested in learning more. But what mattered most to businesses was cost, the ease of procuring the product and consistent quality, where the honey was produced, hyperlocal, like I said, was most important. And then for folks who are using it in food, the taste and flavor profile of the honey. So key insights and recommendations. So, you know, just given how little people really understand about the product right now, there's definitely going to be a need for more consumer awareness and education and preparation of the market as this comes online. So, you know, I think partnerships, you know, with New York State Ag and Markets, the Taste New York program, Cornell Cooperative Extension offices, the Taste New York market locations, as well as New York State Division of Tourism, are all going to be critical for promoting the story of solar raised honey, educating the population, but also providing technical assistance and training to businesses about, you know, how to talk about the product, and then, you know, how that is linking to the state's renewable energy agenda. And again, I see huge opportunity here, given New York State's focus both on, you know, their agriculture and tourism and, you know, the renewable energy agenda. All these three things really intersect for this product. So for apiarists, I mean, the top market opportunities that we saw from, you know, just a revenue perspective was, you know, the Taste New York retail outlets and other places like Letchworth State Park concessions. So, you know, the volume of people that come to these places, they're looking for local products. They want things that are produced in the region. You've got staff trained to talk about the story of these things. And in the case of Taste New York, they have an online e-commerce site that, you know, people can continue to buy honey afterwards. So there's definitely just a great alignment there for those types of outlets. And while highlighting solar raised honey and local food and drink is important, from what I could gather from the few breweries that I spoke to, it just didn't seem that lucrative for the amount of effort that would go into, you know, producing the honey and the very kind of inconsistent times throughout the year that breweries were looking for honey. This to me didn't seem as much of the opportunity for apiarists producing solar honey. So again, recommendations would be to really begin to build those relationships. Like as Mary Kate was saying, there are no apiarists currently operating in the area. So part of this would be really, finding folks that would be interested in making sure they get connected to these retail locations early on. They develop those relationships. And that they have that consistent product that can go and be sold through there. And additionally, to build relationships with the region's growing food manufacturing sector, many of which currently source their honey from outside the US. And this was something I heard over and over again. If we could source, a consistent, source of honey at the quantities that we need, at the quality, and it had a story like solar raised or organic or things like that, they would love to find a source locally. So food manufacturing in our area is growing. It's part of our regional economic development strategies. So again, I see, the key takeaways for me from all of this was that there certainly is market opportunity here, but again, it's going to require a lot of consumer education and working with these businesses to support those relationships and with the apiarists and making sure that there's that consistent source as this evolves and grows. So with that, I will end. Thank you very much. And as Mary Kate and others have said, please go ahead and read the report. There's much more detail in there. And if you have any questions, or do not hesitate to reach out, and I will put my email in the chat here. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nicole. Those insights are very valuable. Thank you everyone for sticking around to the Q&A. I know we have several questions that are available right now, and I'll try to work through all of them from start to end and point them towards some of our panelists to answer. First question came in that were, what are some of the other egg crops besides apples and bees that depend on pollination? I can answer this one real quick. There's, at least 2/3 of the food that we eat are depending on pollinators for our bees for pollination. In the Midwest, alfalfa, canola, and sunflowers are probably, as far as land mass, the most used for pollination with bees. Imagine that out in New York, we're looking at blueberries. I know that's a big crop that people go out to pollinate out that way as well. But generally, if it's a fruit, it's going to require that. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.
Then coming down, how well do apiaries do alongside sheep under the panels? Maybe this is a question that Mary Kate that you'd like to tackle, since you're in both worlds.
Yeah, Dustin, do you have any sheep? Well, so let me just say, we have bees and sheep on my farm here at home, even though we don't have solar panels. And it is important to fence around the bees because the sheep love rubbing up on things and getting a good scratch. So the sheep would easily knock over a colony. But most people are going to be fencing around the bees anyway. In our area, we've got bear that pose a risk of predation to honeybees. So a fence that would stop a bear is probably going to stop a sheep.
Yeah, definitely. And we have hives on several solar arrays that are managed by sheep also. And what the grazers do is they have what's called mob grazing, where they'll do intensive grazing with a large amount of sheep in a short period of time, and then move them off site. And that's generally how it works in our area. And so when there needs to be a mow down of a certain bloom that's happening or crop that's happening, and they usually do it after the bloom happens, then they'll go in and it mows it down and then lets room for the new flowers to come up in the next cycle. What has been the history of beekeeping in the Finger Lakes, Great Lakes region? Has it gone up?
Dustin,
or
really
down?
quickly, I'm so
Yep.
sorry to interrupt you, but before we go any further with questions, I do want to share with you guys those folks who are still around, we are actually also doing a gift giveaway, and Dustin and his company Bear Honey were kind enough to help us with this. So there's going to be 4 prizes for 4 lucky folks who are still here, and it'll be $35 to use at Bear Honey. And their website is right here, and I can send it to you as well. But so the deal is, if you pick a number between 1 and 100, and please email it to me right here, eva@usesusa.org. And then the 4 closest folks will receive the code to access that discount there. So sorry, Dustin, to just cut you off, but I wanted to make sure that we got this in there. And yeah, once again at 7:30, I'll let you guys know who won. And thank you.
No
I'll
problem.
put my email in the chat too.
You have to remind me of that. I don't do self-promotion very well. So history of beekeeping in the Finger Lakes and Great Lakes region, has it gone up or down, and why do you think? Again, Mary Kate, I think that you are probably best suited to answer this.
Yeah, so I am not a historian of beekeeping, but I've heard some great presentations at some of the local bee clubs in our area. And my understanding is that there used to actually be a lot more honeybees in New York State back when our state was much more agricultural. And since, I don't know, there's probably people on this call that know this better than I do, but since about the 1930s, we've had a land use shift back into forest in New York State from agriculture. So we used to have much larger area of land in agriculture. And one of the big crops was buckwheat. And so buckwheat is a huge honey crop that used to lead to ginormous honey yields in this area. Now buckwheat is not grown as abundantly in the Finger Lakes and in New York State. And so our main honey crops tend to be clovers in the summertime, goldenrod and asters in the fall. And then the expanding range of some of these invasive plants have actually really supported honey yields in New York. So even though they're not great from an environmental conservation perspective, purple loosestrife and spotted knapweed, some of these plants are actually really high yielding honey plants that have sort of replaced buckwheat in terms of their importance.
Great. Next question comes, I'm the chair of a town planning board, and we asked a solar developer to include bees in their project plan, but they refused, citing liability over potential bee allergies of residents near the facility. How can we address this concern and encourage bees on the site? Dave and Kevin Campbell's now on also from EDF Renewables, and this might be something that you guys have dealt with in the past, and concerns on how you may have alleviated those.
I haven't ran into any issues so far with that, because the sites are far enough away from the houses or anything that it just never has crossed our plate yet. So I don't know about any thought from Kevin.
Yeah, can you hear me? Hi, can you hear me?
Kind of quiet there, Kevin.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, there we can hear you now.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, just want to thank everybody who participated in the study, and again, the town of Mount Morris for taking the leadership to and the vision to create a study that involved looking into grazing sheep and managing bees on a large solar facility in upstate New York. So thanks very much for sharing all this information. It's very helpful for the development community. Yeah, so actually, as we were engaging with the community in Mount Morris, for example, there was one neighbor who had concerns around the siting of our bee colonies. And so that's something that we'll need to take into consideration once the final locations are determined with the apiarists that we end up working with in the future. But that's a good question.
Definitely. Also, this dust from bear honey. We've also worked with the Solar Grazing Association to develop a contract with landowners, developers, and beekeepers or grazers that helps lay out expectations of what the community should expect. And with input from your local beekeeper, just as Kevin was saying, or Dave was saying rather, keeping these solar installations are rather large, and if bees are on one side of them and houses are on the opposite side, there's generally not much interaction between the bees and the residents. We have another question that was about if higher prices are paid for honey that's from solar. And I can attest that, we work with several beekeepers that we contract to place on solar as well. And we pay them about 18% higher in the barrel than the same honey that's produced on other sites that are not solar. So there's definitely a premium that people are willing to pay. I know that Nicole's research was from 2020 and at the very nascent edge of what was happening. I can say that in the last 2 years since her research, that the differentiating factor of solar grown and the consumer education of what solar grown honey is and events like this is taking place. Last spring in Disney for their garden at Epcot Center for their garden show in the spring. We had a honey from a solar facility that was made by First Magnitude Brewery, and it was the beer of promotion for the Epcot Disneyland or Disney World rather. So it's definitely, the bigger companies are recognizing it. We work with companies all across the United States to make solar grown beverages and food manufactured goods. And so solar as a differentiating factor, it is definitely increasing. Next question is, what research has been done on potential glare from solar panels that impact the bee's ability to produce honey and function? There's none that I'm aware of. Kevin, have you heard of any?
Sorry, Dustin, what was the question again?
The question was, is there any research on how the potential glare from panels impacts the bee's ability to produce honey or function?
Yeah, nothing that I'm aware of. I haven't seen anything about that. I don't know if Mary Kate has seen anything to that effect.
Nope, I haven't.
No. The next question comes, it's a two-part question. And this is for Mary Kate. Did all apiaries use the same type of hive, i.e. Langstroth or not? So Langstroth is a type of hive that we use with removable frames. There's other hives that could be used. In considering colony health as an important part of the sustainable beekeeping and profitability, is there any data regarding the health of colonies, queen's brood in solar installations compared to others?
So yeah, the first part, we did use a Langstroth hive in the model, the economic model that we developed. That's certainly the norm for commercial beekeepers in New York State. So the other types of hives are often used on a smaller scale, maybe by backyard or hobby beekeepers, but not very common in commercial operations. And then in terms of the health of colonies on solar sites, I think I haven't heard of any research specifically on that topic, but I would again go back to this idea that what's important is the composition of the landscape around where the bees are located. And there's tons of research on colony health that can tell us what are good types of land covers and land uses and what are risky or more sort of dangerous types. So I think that a lot of that research is very easily applicable to this question of solar beekeeping.
And Destin, if I could just add to that, we do have a site near Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, that's on 180 acres of land where we do graze sheep and manage bees concurrently. We hire an apiarist, and actually we pay the apiarist directly, and we get all of the honey that's produced on site, about 300 jars, 312 ounce jars every year that then we, we kind of give to stakeholders throughout the year. But yeah, the solar glare, again, if it would be an issue, it hasn't been an issue on that site. And again, it's a great example of a site where both sheep and bees are living harmoniously together. So just wanted to share that real life example too.
Yes, I'm not aware of anything as far as the solar glare. The only issue that I've run across is there was a site in Spain that we were consulting on, and the beekeeper there that was previously there had too many hives on the site for the size of the site. And then when their bees were affected by nosema, they would defecate onto the arrays, and it caused a cleaning problem. That, as far as bees being co-located on solar, that's the only instance of a problem with the solar that I've run across thus far. Let's see. There's a few people that have asked, are apiaries established on the solar site or around the solar site? And I believe, Mary Kate, you have, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you have done the study with the hives outside the fence, so not directly underneath the panels, but adjacent to the site along the fencing outside of it. Is that correct?
Yeah, this might actually be a question for Kevin, because the Morris Ridge site is still in the planning stages. And so we don't have, the panels have not yet been constructed, and everything is still, you know, we picked some potential sites for apiaries, but the design of that hasn't been finalized. We've talked about including it in both ways. So I'm not sure how they'll end up doing it on that project.
Yeah, I think that's a question yet to be determined. And because we do intend on having both the sheep and the pollinators on site, there'll have to be some separation between the two. And we're working with people like Mary Kate and other consultants that help us design, you know, the site appropriate to both grazing and pollinating too.
Sounds good. And I can test that in all of our sites, there's only one site that we have bees inside the fence, and that's because it's a multi-zone site, and that there's large amounts of agriculture in between the solar arrays. And so we have access inside the site. But other than that, all of our hives are located on the fencing outside of the site. This is probably a good time to take a quick pause from questions, and then Eva, if you would like to announce one of the winners tonight for the honey.
Sure. Yeah, let's go for it. So the number was 74. Nobody got it right on the nose, but the closest folks that we had were, and I'm very sorry if I you know, pronounce anybody's names wrong, but I have Ron Kamen, Vincent Petrizillo, Ram Shrivastava, and Terry Fountain. So I will be emailing all of you guys and giving you the discount code that you can use. So congratulations. And thank you once again for Dustin for letting us do this.
Of course. All right. What else do we have here for questions? Somebody asked if having the pollinators and the sheep under the solars with proper design is a good way to effectively manage the land. You know, and Kev, I can say from my experience that the solar vegetation management companies that manage some of the sites that we're on with the intensive mob grazing are very effective at using that, and they've switched completely over to the sheep for vegetation management with a very small amount of like pinpoint vegetation management, where they have to remove some invasive species with mechanical means. But Kevin, you have more experience on a whole with vegetation management on your sites.
Yeah, from understanding from our site at Arnprior, again, there's a lot of benefits from having the site grazed by sheep. I guess number one, it's producing an agricultural byproduct, which is really amazing. Number two, sometimes when you're working with mechanical mowers, they'll kind of kick rocks and potentially damage panels. So the sheep are a lot more gentle from that perspective. And then also working with farmers, you now have additional eyes and ears around the site. So you have other people who can sort of alert the operations team about certain things that need to be, looked after around the site, for example. So there's a lot of benefits for us and benefits for the grazer as well. And it's really a win-win situation. So hopefully we see a lot more of this in New York State. And my understanding right now is in New York State, there's already 1,000 acres of solar panels that are being grazed by sheep underneath.
Excellent. Next question comes in from Jennifer Murphy, and she says, what is the difference between in quality or health benefits from honey being produced on solar farm versus not? Are people paying higher prices simply because the solar is attached to it and they think it's a greener option? And follow-up question is it actually greener? Mary Kate, would you like to start an answer to that?
Sure, I am not aware of any difference in quality or health benefits in honey produced on a solar farm versus not. And as we mentioned, bees are likely foraging in the landscape well beyond the boundaries of the solar installation. So they're likely to produce honey similar to other apiaries in the region. And I think people are excited about marketing solar honey because it highlights the production of solar energy. So is the honey itself actually greener? I'm not sure, but it is reflective of this sort of exciting idea around integrating solar and agriculture. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, I think that's a great take on it. And I would second that also. And that, as Nicole had alluded to, in states that are moving towards higher mandates of having renewable energy, this is a way that we can provide a tangible connection to that energy production, where simply, checking a form on your monthly bill that you want solar energy, doesn't change the way the light looks in your house, but buying a jar of honey from a solar array or a company like EDF passing out jars of honey from an agricultural practice that's on their energy production facilities is a way that they can tangibly connect with their consumers on what the concept of agrivoltaics really is. And the concept of agrivoltaics is the real bonus or the real crux of what we're talking about today, and that we're combining what is called multi-stacking of environmental benefits. So we're not just harvesting, energy from the sun for power at your house, but the bees are also harvesting that energy from the sun to pollinate crops that are surrounding it. On many of the sites that we're on, they're surrounded by apple orchards or squash farms that require pollination from our bees as well. And so, the placement of the hives on the sites that are benefiting from the cyclically blooming pollen cycles of the crops that are the flowers that are inside the solar array are then providing healthier bees to go and pollinate the crops that are outside of the fence as well. And it's this multi-stacking of benefits that's going to change the economy of the future, where we're not looking at externalities of energy production being smog and soot, but the externalities of energy production being pollination and production of agriculture. And that's what we're really talking about today. And that's what is the most valuable about agrivoltaics. Who else has a question? Given the range that bees fly cover, how can honey be labeled organic or solar?
Would you like to that one?
Yeah, I think you may have answered that in your last one, but if you want to just repeat.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. And it's actually really rare to see honey that's produced in this country labeled as organic, because the land that the bees are foraging on typically is managed by lots of different people using lots of different management strategies. And it's really difficult to locate bees in an area where you have control over what's going on in their entire foraging range. So I think often if you see organic honey in the supermarket, it's actually imported from another country that may have either vast areas of wild land or a different set of standards for certifying organic. So be aware if you're interested in supporting your local beekeeper. You may not be able to find an organic certification, but you can certainly ask the beekeeper about the practices that they use to manage their bees. And then in terms of the solar question, I think that the solar honey label is not meant to imply that bees are receiving all of their nutrition from within a solar site. Simply that there's a partnership between the solar development and the beekeeper. And again, this idea that not only are they supporting a beekeeper, but hopefully also investing in those plant communities that can support honeybees and other pollinators.
Great answer. Then we have, let's see, there's another question from Jennifer. Are you hoping to increase the number of apiaries or apiarists in New York through teaming up with solar farms? That's probably a question for you also, Mary.
Oh yeah, so no, that is not my mission. It's an exciting thought, but I think that really the mission for me and being involved in this study is trying to help inform solar developers and people in the solar industry of how they can approach working with beekeepers if that's their goal. There are fantastic resources for people interested in beekeeping that in New York State, there's really strong network of local beekeeping clubs. So most counties have a beekeeping club, if not at the county level, then certainly at the regional level. And then Cornell University has the DICE Lab for Honeybee Studies that has an excellent extension program. And there's other organizations as well. So the best place to start probably is to contact your local cooperative extension office, or there's actually a website or a page on the DICE Lab website that lists all the local beekeeping clubs in New York State. So I'll try to throw that in the chat.
Excellent. I think that actually answers the remaining two questions also, which were, what's the best way to learn about bees? So, I want to thank all of our panelists here tonight. We're just about at the end, and I think that we have answered all the questions. There's one more that just got in. How about maintenance, chemicals being sprayed around on the site? And often I can help answer this also because we have a lot of experience working with our vegetation management companies that are on these sites. And we have a detailed vegetation management plans that are presented to us as beekeepers. And I highly recommend that any beekeepers that are working with a solar company ask for their plantings that are on the site, as well as their vegetation management plans, so that you can design your beekeeping season around which plants will be available. But again, I want to thank everybody for coming to the webinar tonight. I highly appreciate all the panelists inputs, and if Eva is still on, she may want to close out the session. Eva, are you still here?
I am still here. Right. So I just sent out all the discount codes to the folks who are the winners tonight, and thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to our panelists and Dustin as well. And once again, if you'd like to become a member of USES, usesusa.org/membership. If you'd like to support USES so we can continue to do things like this, please look at usesusa.org/donate. Anything is absolutely greatly appreciated. And yeah, I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva.